The night sky over Earth was quiet, but far away in the stars, there was no peace. Voices had risen in despair, carried by broken signals through the blackness. The cries begged for help, begging for angels to save them from endless war. The signals reached Earth, a planet hardened by its own history of struggle. It was not angels who listened, it was people. Leaders gathered in secret halls to hear the message. They spoke of risk, of distance, of the danger of sending their sons and daughters into a war not their own. Some said Earth should remain silent, but silence had never been the way of humanity. In the cities, in the towns, and the farms, people already knew. They had seen their own past when no one came to save them, when survival came only through their own will. They understood the weight of the call. Across the land, the news spread. Men and women read the words carried from the stars. They thought of the children whose voices cried. They thought of homes burning under skies filled with fire. They thought of chains holding people down while enemies crushed them. They could not turn away. These were not strangers. They were people like them, and humanity had never ignored such a cry. Among those who heard was Jason, a young captain who had seen war on Earth and carried the scars of it. His jaw tightened as he read the message. Beside him was Maria, a soldier who had lost her family in the last great conflict on Earth. Her eyes were steady, filled with something fierce. She said they were not angels, but they could still answer. Jason nodded, and in that moment he knew the path was set. In the capital, Queen Alina stood before her council. She was not robed in gold or crowned in jewels. Her strength was in her voice and in the fire of her spirit. She spoke of duty, of the cries that had reached them. She said they would not send angels because Earth had none to give. What they would send were their sons and daughters, men and women who knew the meaning of pain, loss, and survival. They would send the creatures of Earth. Ships were made ready, not blessed with wings or light, but armed with steel and fire. People of Earth prepared knowing they might never return. They were not holy, but they were willing. When the call went out, Earth answered, not with angels, but with warriors. Queen Alina stood on the high steps of the Capitol Hall as the sun rose over the city. The people had gathered in silence, their faces turned to her with questions burning in their hearts. They wanted to know if the cries from the stars would be ignored or answered. Her cloak moved in the morning wind, and when she raised her hand, the crowd grew still. Her voice was steady and clear, carrying to every ear in the square. She spoke of the message, of the voices that had begged for angels. She told them there would be no angels, only people. She said Earth could not hide behind its oceans and mountains while others suffered. She said the time had come for men and women of Earth to rise, not as saints, but as fighters. In the crowd stood farmers with calloused hands, workers covered in dust, students with bright eyes, and soldiers who had once thought they were done with war. When Alina called, they felt the weight of her words. They remembered their own struggles and the price their ancestors had paid for freedom. One by one, they raised their voices, not in fear, but in agreement. They would not stay behind. They would stand and fight. In the training fields, men and women lined up, ready to be chosen. Captains moved among them, testing their strength and will. Jason stood at the front of his group, calm and firm. Maria trained beside him, her movements sharp and full of fire. They were joined by others who had never held a weapon before, but who carried courage in their hearts. Earth was not sending angels, it was sending its people, and that was enough. Ships were built with speed, iron, and firepower. The sound of hammers striking metal echoed through the nights as workers refused to rest. Mothers kissed their children, and fathers held their families, knowing the path ahead would be long. No one pretended it would be easy, yet no one turned away. They all understood what Queen Alina had declared. Those who cried in the stars would not be left alone. When the first ship was ready, Queen Alina walked among the warriors. She looked each one in the eyes and spoke only one sentence. She told them they were not angels, but something stronger. They were Earth's creatures, and the enemy would learn to fear them. The crowd lifted their voices, and the sound rose like thunder across the city. The first fleet of Earth rose into the sky, their engines shaking the ground as families watched from below. The sound was not of angels with trumpets, but of machines built by human hands. The warriors stood inside, their armor plain and heavy, their weapons made for killing. Jason stood at the front of his unit, his hand tight around his rifle. Maria sat across from him, her eyes sharp and full of fire. Now neither spoke. They did not need words. They knew what waited ahead. When the ships broke into the void, silence filled the cabins. Each man and woman thought of what they had left behind. Some whispered prayers, others clenched fists, and many stared straight ahead. They were not holy beings, and they carried no promise of mercy. They were creatures of earth, and they were ready to fight. At last the ships reached the burning world where the cries had come from. Flames lit the horizon, towers broken, smoke rising to the sky. The warriors of Earth looked out from the windows, their jaws set. Jason was the first to move. He ordered his squad to prepare. Maria lifted her rifle and checked the charge. The doors opened, and the air was filled with heat and ash. The first sight of the people on the ground was one of shock. They had expected shining figures wrapped in light. Instead, they saw armored men and women pouring out like a flood, their boots striking the earth, their rifles aimed with deadly calm. The people whispered the word angels, but the warriors did not look like angels. They looked like storm and fire. Jason led the charge through the ruined streets, his voice steady as he gave orders. Maria fought at his side, her war cry cutting through the roar of battle. The enemy scattered before them, unprepared for the fury that came from Earth. Blades cut, rifles cracked, and walls crumbled. It was not mercy that came with the humans. It was power, sharp and unyielding. When the last shot faded, the ground was covered with smoke and silence. The people stared at the humans, their faces filled with both fear and hope. Jason lowered his weapon and looked to Maria. They both knew this was only the beginning. Earth had answered the call, not with angels, but with its creatures, and the galaxy would soon learn their strength. The battles spread across the broken lands. Human warriors moved through city after city, their steps heavy on the cracked stone streets. The enemy had believed their walls and weapons could hold, but Earth's fighters broke through with fire and steel. Jason led his men through narrow alleys, clearing every corner with careful aim. His voice carried calm commands, never shaken, even when the fight grew fierce. Beside him, Maria swung her blade when the rifle ran empty, each strike leaving no doubt of her strength. In one city, the defenders had built towers with iron gates and high walls. Queen Alina herself rode with the front lines, her white cloak soon stained with dirt and blood. She raised her sword high, calling her people forward. The warriors of Earth answered, their shouts rising like thunder. They smashed through the gates, forcing the enemy back step by step. Fire lit the sky, and the clash of steel rang until the night fell. The people who had prayed for angels watched from the shadows. They had expected beings of light, soft and merciful. What they saw were humans with hard eyes and stained armor. Yet when the fight was done, the humans lifted the weak, carried the wounded, and stood guard through the night. The people began to whisper that maybe these were angels after all, but angels unlike any they had imagined. Jason and Maria moved among the ruins, checking every house. They found children hiding under broken beams and mothers clutching their young. Maria lowered her weapon and knelt to speak softly, her voice steady even as ash fell from the sky. Jason gave food and water, his hands rough but careful. They had fought with fury, yet when the battle was over, their strength turned to protection. As dawn came, Queen Alina stood among her warriors. Her cloak was torn, her sword blackened with battle. She looked at the faces of her people, men and women, who had fought without fear. She told them that every city they freed was a promise kept to those who had cried out for help. She said they were not angels, and they would never be angels, but their power was greater than any wings of light. She said they were the creatures of Earth, and the enemy would never forget their coming. The war did not slow, and with every victory came a heavy price. Human warriors marched on, but the ground they gained was stained with their own blood. Jason carried one of his men from the ruins of a fortress, his uniform burned and torn. He laid him down beside the others, his jaw tight, as he forced himself to move again. Maria stood at a line of graves dug in the foreign soil, her hands still trembling from the fight. She whispered names that no one else would ever speak again, names that now belonged only to the earth. In the camps, the wounded cried out in the night. Men and women who had once stood tall now lay broken, their bodies scarred by fire and steel. The medics worked without rest, their hands soaked with blood. Queen Elena walked among them, her face marked with sorrow, but her steps steady. She touched each shoulder, giving strength with her presence alone. She knew she could not bring back the dead, but she could honor them with every step forward. The people who had prayed for angels began to see the truth. These warriors were not holy. They were flesh and blood. They felt pain and loss as deeply as anyone else, yet even in their grief they stood again and again. When the battle horn sounded, they rose with weapons in hand, refusing to yield. That was what set them apart. Not wings, not light, but the will to keep fighting when others would fall. Jason sharpened his blade in silence, his eyes dark with memory. Maria sat beside him, her rifle across her lap. She told him they could not stop, not while the cries still echoed. He gave a short nod, and the two stood, ready for the next march. Around them, others did the same, each one carrying the weight of the dead, but also the fire of the living. Queen Elena gathered her captains before the next push. She spoke not of glory, but of cost. She told them every victory had been bought with blood, and more would be asked. But she also told them that Earth did not break. She said the enemy would see that pain only made them stronger. They were not angels, they were the creatures of Earth, and they would not stop until freedom was won. The enemy gathered all their strength for one last strike. They filled the horizon with fire and steel, their banners high, their weapons ready to crush what Earth had built. The ground shook as their armies marched. The air was thick with smoke and the promise of death. It was meant to break the will of the humans, to force them into retreat. But the warriors of Earth did not step back. They stood in formation, their weapons steady, their hearts burning with defiance. Queen Elena rode at the front, her sword raised high, her voice carrying above the roar. She told her people that this was the storm they had been waiting for. She said they would not bow, they would not run. If the enemy wanted to see the strength of Earth, then they would see it here. Her words spread through the lines, and every man and woman answered with a cry that shook the sky. Jason stood with his squad at the edge of the battlefield. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set. He gave quick orders, his voice calm even as the ground trembled. Maria checked her rifle one last time, then lifted her blade. She looked at Jason and gave a short nod. They both knew what was coming, and neither showed fear. The clash came with thunder. Fire rained from above, towers crumbled, and steel met steel in a storm of sparks. The air filled with the sound of war, screams and shouts blending with the roar of weapons. Jason pushed forward through the chaos, cutting a path for his men. Maria fought at his side, her strikes fast and brutal, her cry rising above the storm. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting for every voice that had begged for help. Queen Elena charged at the center of the enemy, her white cloak torn and burned. Her sword flashed with each strike, her eyes blazing with fury. She fought like a storm herself, unyielding, unstoppable. Her warriors followed her, breaking the enemy lines with sheer force. The ground shook under their charge, and the banners of the enemy began to fall. As the battle raged, the humans showed no sign of surrender. When one fell, another stepped forward. When the walls crumbled, they climbed over the ruins and kept fighting. They did not pray for miracles, because they were the miracle. They made their own fate with blood and steel, and the storm that was meant to break them became the storm they commanded. The battlefield was silent at last. Smoke curled into the sky, and broken weapons lay across the ground. The cries of war had faded, leaving only the breath of the living and the stillness of the dead. The enemy was crushed, their banners torn and scattered. Where they had stood strong, now only ruins remained. The warriors of Earth stood battered, scarred, but unbroken. Their armor was stained, their faces hard, yet their eyes still carried fire. Queen Elena stood at the front of her people. Her cloak was in rags, her sword chipped and dark from the battles. She lifted it high, and the light of the rising sun struck the steel. The people who had once prayed for angels fell to their knees, their eyes wide with awe. They whispered that their prayers had been answered. They called the humans angels, saviors wrapped in flesh. But Elena shook her head. She told them the truth. She said they were not angels, they were men and women of Earth, and they had come because they could not ignore the call. Jason stood with his rifle resting against his shoulder. His hands were bloody, his body worn, but his voice was steady. He spoke to the freed people, telling them to rise. He said no one was meant to kneel again. Not before kings, not before conquerors, not even before those who had saved them. Maria stood beside him, her blade still in her hand, her eyes burning with strength. She told them they were free now because humans had fought as they always did, not with holiness, but with will. The people began to cheer, their voices rising like thunder across the broken land. For the first time in years, they felt hope. They no longer saw chains or fire, but the promise of life. They looked upon the humans not as distant angels, but as warriors who had bled for them. They saw the truth that Earth's creatures had brought freedom where none dared to stand. Queen Alina lowered her sword and turned to her warriors. She told them their fight had changed the stars forever. She said the galaxy would never forget that when angels were called, it was the creatures of Earth who came. And in that moment, every soldier, every captain, every survivor knew the same truth. If angels did exist, they would fear to stand beside the warriors of Earth.